Welcome to the wheatbarn.com Bibletalk Broadcast.
You know Jesus, is he the fire in your heart? Have you died to self and you're giving him the right to finish what he starts? Will you go to church every Sunday and you sing real loud with the choir? Your mom and dad helped to build that building and you've been going there since you were 5. You memorize a lot of Bible verses and you wear a gold cross on a chain. And now you heard every sermon a dozen ways, but somehow you're still the same. Do you know Jesus? And is he the fire in your heart? Have you died to self and you're giving him the right to finish what he starts? Do you know Jesus? Is he the passion in your eyes? All your righteous works and the sermons you heard could still end in your demise. Do you know Jesus? And is he consuming you like a fire? The new has come and the old is gone, and he's all that you desire. Do you know him? Yeah. I said, do you know him?
Welcome to the wheatbarn.com Bibletalk Broadcast. This is the third episode of the broadcast. We're actually going to do this one live, so if anyone wants to jump into the chat room, you're welcome to. But just wanted to thank you for listening to the show, and we'll see how this goes with the live version. It's the first time I've done this before live on Spreaker. I believe it's also going on YouTube Live, but the show essentially is about talking about the Bible and religion, and we're going to be doing kind of a Bible study, a few chapters at a time each episode. We haven't actually gotten into that yet. The last couple episodes have been basically a discussion overview of Christianity and religion in general. And this one now we're going to, originally I was going to get into going ahead with starting the chapters of the Bible as a study book by book, particularly starting in Genesis chapters 1, 2, 3, and 4. However, for now, I think what I'm going to do for this episode is just kind of give a brief overview of what's in the Bible. I know there's a lot of people out there who have not read it all the way through, and they might get it in little bits and pieces and verses here and there, but might not get the overall story in a consistent, broad overview or broad scope of what actually is in the book from start to end. So this episode, I think it's going to be a shorter episode, but basically I'm just going to kind of go over what's in the Bible from beginning to end, starting with the book of Genesis all the way through the book, the last book, which is the book of Revelation. So we'll go ahead and start out with the book of Genesis and progress forward. The Bible, of course, starts with the creation account, the start of the universe, of heaven and earth, and goes all the way through till not too long after the time of Jesus, around the time of the destruction of the Jewish temple in 70 A.D., roughly that point in time is when the last book of the Bible was written in the 1st century A.D., and then, of course, that was about 2,000 years ago. So if we cover the history covered by the Bible, we have about 6,000 years of recorded history, of which 4,000 is covered in the Bible, but the last book in particular speaks of future prophetic events that are still yet to come even in our time. So the text itself was first written down, the first 5 books called the Pentateuch, or which is Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, were written down by Moses, and this would have been around roughly 1400 BC. But it starts out in the description of the story in those books with the creation of the heavens and the earth, which again is about 6,000 years ago. So quite a bit earlier, but it wasn't written down until the time of Moses. And again, it carries through from that point on till about roughly around the end of the 1st century AD. And the destruction of the Jewish temple in particular, which occurred in 70 AD. So I'll go ahead and start the overview now and just kind of go through everything that's in it. So the first book of the Bible, Genesis, chapter 1, we have a description of the creation of the heavens and the earth, which takes place in 6 days. and then on the seventh day God rests. And most people are familiar with these stories, even if you've never been to Sunday school or anything like that. You've probably heard these stories indirectly before, obviously, because they're pretty well known. But a lot of them aren't necessarily well known. But again, the first chapter of Genesis, we have the first 6 days of creation, and then God rested on the seventh day. And then in Genesis chapter 2, we have a kind of a retelling of a facet of creation, particularly surrounding the creation of Adam and the Garden of Eden, and how Adam got his wife Eve, which was created out of Adam's side, or Adam's rib, by God. And that from that point in time, we get into the third chapter of Genesis, which is a description of the fall of mankind, where man sinned. And this is, of course, the famous story where Adam and Eve eat the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And after Eve was tempted by the serpent, which is a personification of the devil, and it was through this sinning of eating this tree, that the fruit of this tree that they were not supposed to eat, which God had commanded them not to eat of, that sin entered into this world. And the repercussion of sin, it says that the wages of sin is death. That death itself entered into this world through the sin of Adam and Eve. And that original sin is passed on then from generation to generation down to all of us, which is why we need redemption in Jesus Christ to be free of that original sin and from all our sins that we've committed. But in Genesis chapter 3, we have the description of this original sin, this fall, which was committed by Adam and Eve after they were beguiled by the serpent, or rather Eve was beguiled or tricked by the serpent in the Garden of Eden. So from that point in time, Adam and Eve are cast out of the garden for their sin. And then they have two children, Cain and Abel. And Cain and Abel both end up bringing sacrifices or offerings before the Lord, but the Lord has respect for Abel's offering, but disrespects Cain's offering. And because of this, Cain becomes rather angry and jealous and vengeful, and ends up killing his brother Abel. And so this becomes the first physical death, as opposed to the spiritual death that Adam and Eve incurred by eating the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and through sin. The first physical death was in the death of Abel at the hands of his brother Cain. Because of this, Cain is sent out into the wilderness, the land of not wandering, called the land of Nod, out from the presence of even Adam and Eve. And because of this, God steps in to give Adam and Eve another child to replace Abel, whom Cain had slain. And the name of this child is Seth. So Seth is of the lineage of the father of us all. So from Adam to Seth, to his children, and so on and so forth, down to us, is a direct line. We are all directly descended from Seth and from Adam. After Seth, there are several other generations of people listed in the Bible. Cain has several generations of children, and Adam has several generations of children, actually about 10 generations, till we get to a man by the name of Noah. And of course, this is another famous story that most people know in the Bible, which is the story of the flood and Noah's Ark. So the world became very wicked at this point in time, so sinful, in fact, that basically there were only 8 people left that were in a state of grace before the Lord. Noah, his wife, his 3 children, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and their 3 wives. And so because of this, because the world was basically on the verge of total destruction, it was filled with violence, God saved basically the last 8 people that were able to obtain favor in the sight of the Lord, who were, it says that Noah was perfect in his generations, and that he basically had obtained a state of grace in the eyes of the Lord. And so because of this, God told Noah to build an ark in which he and his family would be saved, but also to save a sample of all the different species of animals and so forth, to preserve them on the earth. So he was to take a certain sample of each species, male and female, 7 groups of all the clean animals, it says, and then a smaller sample of all the unclean animals, and to preserve them aboard the ark, because of course God was forced to destroy the world with a flood. And this is the famous story of Noah's Ark. And of course the flood comes along, and Noah and the animals are saved, and then they come out on the other side of the flood to repopulate the earth. And there's a covenant that is formed at this point in time called the Noahide Covenant, which is where you get the story about the rainbow, and the rainbow representing this new covenant where God promises that He would not destroy the earth again with water, as long as as long as there be day and night. Basically, the earth would continue in harvest and in seasons and so forth. So, after the time of Noah, man was wandering on the earth, and God had commanded them, the peoples of the earth at this time, because they're starting to multiply again. God had commanded them to go throughout all the earth and to fill it up and to replenish it. However, man rebelled against this. They did not spread out all over the earth. They stayed together as one group, and they built a city, and they called that city Babel. And there they built a high tower that would reach into the heights of heaven, essentially, and rebelled against what God had told them to do. So God came down and saw that they built this tower in the city and confused their languages so that they couldn't work together, and essentially causing them to scatter all over the face of the earth. And so this is the famous story of the Tower of Babel. And they left off from building this tower, and from there they spread out through the entire planet because of the what happened at the Tower of Babel. And so not long after that, we have the account of a man named Abraham, who God told to leave his homeland and his home people and go to a land that He would show them, and that He would give that land to his descendants, and that his descendants would be greater than the stars of the heaven and the grains of sand in the seashore, that He'd have that many descendants. And so Abraham obeyed God, and he went to that land, and that land was known as the land of Canaan, would eventually become the land of Israel, or the Holy Land. So Canaan obeyed God. He left his city, which is called Ur of the Chaldees, and he went to a place he knew not where he was going, the Bible says, but he went anyway based on faith and what the Lord had told him, to the land that the Lord would show him. And there Abraham had a child by the name of Isaac. And Isaac then later had a child by the name of Jacob, whom the Lord changed Jacob's name to Israel. And that's where you get the name of the nation of Israel, from that account in the Bible. So during this time, they had not actually inherited the land. None of Abraham's descendants had yet inherited the land. They were still wanderers in the land, living in tents, and they had no permanent home, if you will. But they were in the land, but they did not own the land. They did not possess the land yet. So Jacob now, which is the grandson of Abraham, he goes to get a wife back in his home country that they originally came out of. And when he goes to get the wife, he talks to one of his distant relatives as far as being able to marry one of his daughters named Rachel. And in those days, there was in ancient times, there was a certain contractual relationship of the way we would do that for obtaining wives and so forth. And so the father of Rachel, basically, whose name is Laban, basically says that he would give away his daughter to be a wife to Jacob, provided that he worked for him for 7 years. However, Laban tricked Jacob and gave his other daughter, Leah, instead, and Jacob did not know it until after they had consummated the marriage. And so, because of this, Laban said he would give his daughter Rachel still if he worked for an additional 7 years, which he did. So Jacob ended up having 2 wives, Rachel and Leah. And then, in addition to that, he also worked another 6 years for livestock and cattle and so forth. So he spent about 20 years working for Laban, and Laban basically was tricking him the whole time, changing his wages and so forth. But through these 2 wives, and also through 2 servants or concubines of both Rachel and Leah, so that's four women total. From that, and again, this is practice in ancient times. This is not modern practice, obviously. So the culture was very different back then. But what happened at that point in time is, from those 4 women, we have the 12 sons of Israel, which become the 12 tribes of Israel, and then there's also a daughter as well. But the 12 sons that are produced from those 4 women through Jacob become known as the 12 tribes of Israel. They're the forefathers of those 12 tribes. And so eventually what happens is those sons and Jacob and so forth all end up down in Egypt through the actions of one of his sons by the name of Joseph. What happened is Joseph was kind of the favorite son, and his brothers did not like him very much, and so they ended up deciding that they were going to try to have him killed, but eventually they actually ended up selling him as a slave. They capture him in a pit and sell him into slavery into the land of Egypt. Joseph goes down to Egypt, but he ends up obtaining favor with the Pharaoh, or the leader of Egypt at that time, and eventually Pharaoh places him in the second of command of all of Egypt, only after Pharaoh himself. And later on, there's a big famine in basically the whole world, and Egypt has all the corn because of the actions of Joseph, who planned ahead, who was warned by the Lord that this famine was going to come, and planned ahead by storing up corn. And so his family ends up coming down to Egypt to get corn, and through a series of events, they end up basically living in Egypt under the favor of Joseph, and are reunited with him. And so through that, through Joseph, his entire family is saved, and they end up living in Egypt. While they're living in Egypt, they grow, they prosper, they have many descendants and children, and they become a very, very large nation over the course of centuries, of a few centuries. Of course, Joseph passes because centuries are passing by and so forth. And so what happens is, as the nation of Israel continues to grow, a different Pharaoh comes to power who didn't know Joseph, and he feels very threatened by the growth of the Israelites, and so he puts them into bondage and makes them into slaves. And because of this, they spend a long period of time in slavery and toil in the land of Egypt, until eventually God sends a deliverer by the name of Moses to free them out of the land of Egypt. And Moses is actually a member of the nation of Israel, but there's a whole series of events that takes place where Moses actually ends up fleeing out of the land, goes away for about 40 years, and then comes back because God reveals himself on Mount Sinai in a form of a burning bush, and basically commands him to go to Egypt in order to free his people. So Moses goes to Egypt, and he commands Pharaoh to let the Israelites go, but Pharaoh does not want to let them go. He wants to keep them in slavery. And so God sends 10 plagues, basically, to convince Pharaoh to finally let the children of Israel go, or the people of Israel go. And so Pharaoh finally relents after the last plague. The plague of the firstborn is known, because all the firstborn Egyptians died in it. And so eventually Pharaoh is forced to let all the Israelites go. And as they were fleeing to go out of the land, Pharaoh changes his mind. He chases after them with chariots and horsemen, and they come to the place of the Red Sea, and God divides and parts the Red Sea. This is the miracle of the parting of the Red Sea, and all the people of Israel go through the Red Sea on dry ground, and then when the Egyptians chase after them, the sea comes crashing back down on them again, and they all drown. All the Egyptians drown. But the Israelites are free on the other side. And from there, God brings the Israelites to a mountain called Mount Sinai and gives them the 10 Commandments, the famous 10 Commandments, and also teaches them the law and makes a covenant with them of the different law and things that they're supposed to practice in order to maintain that covenant and obtain the blessing of the Lord, and to avoid any curses for violating the covenant. So from that point in time, God brings them back to the land of Canaan in order to have them conquer the land and take possession of it, because that was the original promise that God had made to Abraham, that would be their land. However, when they're brought back to the land of Canaan, they are fearful of going in and conquering the land, because it says that there were giants in the land. They were fearful of the inhabitants there, and they didn't trust that the Lord would be with them in order to help them conquer the land, because the people in the land were actually the Canaanites were very wicked people, and so God was going to judge them by basically committing an act of war against them as a form of judgment, and having the Israelites take over the land. However, the Israelites disobeyed. They didn't have faith. They didn't believe in God enough to go in and conquer the land, except for a couple people, Joshua and Caleb, who were spies who went to spy out the land, who did believe the Lord, but the rest of the Israelites did not. And so because of this, God sent them back into the wilderness to wander around for 40 years until that entire generation passed away, and then their children will be able to enter into the land of Israel. And so that's what happened. They went out in the wilderness, they wandered around for 40 years. God fed them miraculously through what's called manna, which was a miraculous form of food that was provided to them in the desert. And eventually then that whole generation dies off, and then their children are brought back to the land of Canaan, and they're about to enter in and conquer it. Moses dies at this point in time, but then a captain by the name of Joshua takes over, one of the spies who was faithful and believed that they could go and conquer the land. So it's 40 years later now, but Joshua basically takes over and leads the nation of Israel into the land, and they begin conquering the land of Canaan, and it becomes the land of Israel. And that's the same area where Israel resides today. So Israel now has conquered the land, and from that point in time, they didn't have a king, but they did have a series of judges. So what would happen is they would live okay for a while, but then they would fall into a sinful state, and God would raise up a judge in order to set them free from whatever the repercussions of their actions had led them to. And then they would kind of keep repeating this process over and over again. And so there was a series of judges that goes on, but there was no king yet in the land. And eventually, the people, after a couple centuries, demand that they want a king like the nations around them. So God gives them a king by the name of Saul, who ends up being a rather harsh king, but also a rather rebellious king against the Lord. And Saul reigns for some time. However, after a while, Saul sins against the Lord, and God decides that he's no longer going to be king. And so God raises up another king by the name of David, who was a king after God's heart. And David's a very famous king, and David is the one who basically founds the city of Jerusalem, as we know today, to be the capital and to be the place of the temple, which would be the center of worship for the nation of Israel. Because what had happened was when the Israelites were wandering in the desert prior to conquering the land, they had a tent center of worship called a tabernacle, and in the center of that tent center of worship that they would carry around with them and set up, they had the 10 Commandments that were handed down on tables of stone were placed into a box called the Ark of the Covenant. And that was the meeting place where the Lord would come down and descend and meet with them in a cloud of glory. And so they would wander around the desert, they would set up this tent, and that was their central place of worship, was this temple made out of a tent material, basically, called the tabernacle. So David wanted to create a permanent house for the Lord, a permanent temple made not like a tent, but made out of stone and as a permanent fixture. However, the Lord did not allow him to do that because David was a man of war. He committed a lot of killing and so forth. And so he said that he would let his son do it, whose name was Solomon, who became king after David passed. And so Solomon was the one who built the temple. And he built the temple roughly about 480 years after the Exodus, after they came out of Egypt and went through the Red Sea. So Solomon builds the temple. And this is now in the city of Jerusalem. And from the time of Solomon building the temple, we have one kingdom, one king, but after the reign of Solomon, there's a civil war that takes place. And the nation of Israel is divided into two kingdoms, or two nations. There's the 10 northern tribes, known as the northern kingdom of Israel, and then there's the southern tribes, the two southern tribes, known as the kingdom of Judah. Because of the name of the primary tribe there was Judah, which is where you get the name Jew from, or Jews. Because what happens is those two tribes continue on for many centuries. However, the northern kingdom of Israel, those 10 tribes, get taken into captivity by a nation called the Assyrians, and they kind of disappear from history. They're called the 10 lost tribes of Israel, and many people wonder what happened to them, but that's another discussion. So So from that point, after many centuries of good kings and bad kings, and kings that would do right according to the Lord, and then kings would fall into sin, on both the north and the south, finally, as I mentioned, the northern kingdom's taken into captivity by the Assyrians, but the southern kingdom of Judah would continue on for many decades more, even more than a century more. And eventually, the Assyrians would be taken over by an empire known as the Babylonians, which is kind of a restoration of their empire, because they originally were the first empire going all the way back to the Tower of Babel. But the Assyrians later would come along and kind of become the world empire, but then the Babylonians would rise up again, and this is known as the Neo-Babylonian Empire. But the Babylonians would end up taking captive the southern kingdom of Israel, known as the Kingdom of Judah. And they would take them into bondage and captivity for 70 years. They destroyed the temple that Solomon built, but then after 70 years later, the Persians would come along and take over the Babylonian Empire, and then under a king named Cyrus, and they would let the Israelites go back home again and rebuild the temple. And so this is about the 5th century BC approximately that this happens. And so, again, the northern kingdom kind of disappears from history. The southern kingdom, after many generations of kings, both good and bad, gets taken into captivity by the Babylonians. And then after 70 years, the Persians take over, and they let the Israelites return back home to rebuild their temple. And so for many decades, then the Israelites continue on. They rebuilt their temple, and then they rebuild the city of Jerusalem as well, and the walls around it under a man by the name of Nehemiah. And then after the time of Nehemiah and the Persians, what happens is there's a period of silence in the Bible, because basically we've gone through the historical period now of the Bible. And this is basically the book of Genesis all the way through the book of Nehemiah. And so there's this period of silence where there's no longer prophets and so forth, at least not in the biblical canon. There's extra biblical books, or deuterocanonical or apocryphal books like Maccabees and so forth. But this is known as the period of silence, where there's no prophets rising up to speak anymore. And it's basically the space of time between the Old Testament and the New Testament. And so during this time, the Persians get taken over by the Greeks, and then eventually the Greeks get taken over by the Romans. And it's the Romans who are in power in the time that Jesus comes about in the New Testament. In fact, Israel is a client state or a puppet state of Rome during this time, just as they were a puppet state of the Greeks earlier and a puppet state of the Persians before that. So now we're into the period of the New Testament. Now, to back up for a second on the Old Testament, the books of Genesis all the way through the books of Nehemiah give a historical account, which I just went over. But in addition to that, there are other books as well. There are many prophetic books, major prophets, which are larger prophetical books, and then many minor prophets. And these are people that, during the times of particularly of the kings of northern Israel and southern Israel, or the kingdom of Judah, God was sending prophets to warn the people to repent of their sin, to warn the Israelites to return back to the ways, the covenant that they had established with the Lord, so that God would not bring about judgment upon them and bring them into captivity and destroy their land and their temple and their city, their capital, Jerusalem, and so forth. But despite all the prophets that the Lord kept sending, Israel would continue to fall into sin, and eventually their captivity came about. But then God again restored them and allowed them to rebuild their temple. So the prophets are basically kind of the back end of the Old Testament after the historical books, but all those prophets are people that came and gave warnings to the nation of Israel for the most part. In addition to that, there are also some other books in the Bible that are kind of teaching books, or they call it the writings, or they're poetical books as well, like Psalms, which are kind of prophetical songs, basically, that were originally put to music for the most part, but they're like little poems almost, if you will. There's Proverbs, which are little sayings of wisdom. There's wisdom literature. There's Song of Solomon and so forth, which is a very poetical type literature as well. But these are most of these are prophetic in nature too. Most of the Bible is prophetic in one form or the other. So these books and the prophetic books and the historical books all make up the Old Testament. And so with the end of the prophets and the end of the historical point in time where the city of Israel is rebuilt after the restoration of the temple, and you enter this period of kind of prophetic silence for a few centuries, that's the cessation of the Old Testament. And then after a few centuries, now we get down to about the time of Jesus, which is around 1 BC, 1 AD, when he's born. And Jesus is the prophesied Messiah that they had foretold would come in the Old Testament, particularly in the book of Daniel, talking about that there would be a Messiah or an anointed king who would come out of Israel, who would become king of the whole world. And so they were looking for this Messiah to come about that time, about the time of Jesus. And about the time of the destruction of the temple, which would occur several decades later. So the time of Jesus starts now in the Bible, and you have the first four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, which describe the birth and the life of Jesus and his death, burial, and resurrection, and then his ascension into heaven, and how he died for our sins, and how he would come again in the future one day to become king of all the earth and to rule and reign for 1,000 years. And it's through him that we're saved, and through his sacrifice that we can become born again and attain eternal life. And those Gospels, in addition to that, contain his teachings. But of course, this is familiar knowledge for just about everyone in this day and age, the knowledge of Christianity and Jesus and so forth. So those are the first four books of the New Testament, the Gospel, that describe the life and the teachings of Jesus. And then after the ascension of Jesus into heaven, after his death, burial, and resurrection, then we have the book of Acts, which is what happens with the church after the time of Jesus, shortly after the time of Jesus, in the few decades that follow, and what they do during that time, and particularly a man by the name of Paul, because Jesus had 12 disciples that he trained up, and who would carry on his ministry on this earth after he after he ascended onto heaven. He left his 12 disciples to do his earthly ministry, but after that time came a man by the name of Paul, who had a vision of Jesus on the road to Damascus. He originally was persecuting those Christians, but he converted and became a Christian himself, and it is Paul that preaches and proselytizes to most of the Gentile world, or the Roman world at the time, and through the Mediterranean basin and through Europe and so forth. And that's what really drives the spread of Christianity throughout Europe. And so after that, we have a number of, after the book of Acts, which gives a lot of it about the account of the life of Paul, we get into the epistles, which are writings or letters that are exchanged from the apostles, particularly of Paul. Many of these are letters from Paul to different churches in the region, giving them teachings and prophetic information and another, other types of writings, basically. But that's where we get a lot of our modern day Christian doctrine from those particular writings that were exchanged as letters amongst the early churches. And then, of course, the last book of the Bible is the book of Revelation, which is a prophetic book that contains a variety of different elaborate imagery and allegory and so forth to give information about the return of Christ and the future judgment and the end of the world, if you will, and the eternal reign of Christ forever and ever, and our eternal salvation and eternal judgment on the wicked and so forth. And so that is the last book of the Bible, and that's kind of the overview of the Bible from beginning to end. So I just wanted to kind of do that briefly in this particular episode because I think it was important to give a general overview before I actually get into the Bible study itself, so that you kind of understand the framework of what's going on here. But that's basically the entire Bible in a nutshell. And so what I'm going to do now in future episodes is study the Bible chapter by chapter, we'll probably do about 4 chapters at a time. Just to kind of let you know also what happened after the last book of the Bible was written. The temple that they rebuilt, the Jews rebuilt after they came back from the Babylonian captivity, was eventually destroyed a few decades after Jesus rose into heaven in 70 A.D. And from that time, the Jews were basically at war with the Romans off and on from about 66 A.D. all the way till about 135 A.D. Again, this is now getting the time after the Bible was written. And so there were several wars that were going on during that time. There was the original Jewish revolt that started in 66 A.D., which eventually caused the temple to be destroyed and culminated with a final siege at a place called Masada around 73 A.D., and that's how that war ended. There was another war called Caido's War that happened several decades later, and then there was one last war called the Bar Kokhba Revolt, where basically everyone that was left in the nation of Israel was pretty much wiped out, sold into slavery and bondage, whoever were remaining, and dispersed throughout the rest of the world, basically the Roman world, and this becomes known as the diaspora. And this is how the nation of Israel was sent out of the land of Israel. And from that time, the city of Jerusalem became a Roman city known as Aelia Capitolina, and there's a pagan Roman temple that was built in Jerusalem, where the city was originally destroyed and this new city was built. And that temple lasted for several centuries. However, Christianity continued to spread in the Roman world, and eventually the Roman Empire would divide into 2 sections, because in the east most people spoke Greek, and in the west most people spoke Latin. And so an emperor by the name of Constantine came along, and he developed a new capital for the east called Constantinople, which today is Istanbul, in order to rule the eastern half of the Roman Empire, and then Rome, of course, ruled the western half of the Roman Empire. And so Constantine kind of divided the empire into 2 parts, east and west. But Constantine did something else, and that is he made Christianity the main religion of the Roman Empire, because prior to that time, for several centuries, Christians have been heavily persecuted by the Romans, but it was Constantine who essentially made Christianity acceptable and eventually the state religion of the Roman Empire. Not too long after the time of Constantine, Rome itself fell in the west. This was the end of the Western Roman Empire. However, it continued on in the east through Constantinople for another 1,000 years, and actually that's referred to as the Byzantine Empire, but in reality it's just the Eastern Roman Empire continuing on. So the Eastern Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire, would continue on all the way up till shortly before the time of Christopher Columbus, before it eventually fell to the Ottomans and the Islamic world and so forth. The Western Roman Empire, however, which came to its end around the end of the late 400s A.D., the vacuum that was created by the barbarians coming in and taking over, sacking Rome and taking over the Roman Empire, the vacuum that was created by the collapse of the Roman Empire was primarily fulfilled or filled in that void by the Catholic Church, the Roman Catholic Church, who then pretty much ruled Western Europe indirectly by appointing the kings and so forth as subordinates to the Roman Church for many, many centuries. And so for many centuries, Europe, in fact, was called Christendom as opposed to Europe, as it was underneath the power of the Roman Catholic Church. And so that all, again, continued on till about shortly after the time of Columbus, in the 1500s, where there was what's a period known as the Reformation. And what happened during this period is a famous priest by the name of Martin Luther protested against several actions of the Catholic Church, believing that they were not biblical or not proper. And he ended up actually breaking away from the Catholic Church and starting, because he was protesting against it, started Protestantism, from which you get the word Protestant comes from the word protest. So from that time period known as the Reformation, you get the Protestant denominations, and they kind of break off into several different branches of denominations, which gives us all the different churches that we have today eventually. In addition to that, something else very important happened during that time, which was the invention of the Gutenberg printing press, because prior to that time, in order to get the Word of God, you had to go to church, because the Bibles were not prevalent and just distributed all throughout the world, and they were only primarily kept in Latin language in order to preserve the text without being the threat of having it mistranslated or being corrupted through various translations and so forth. So the Bible had to be copied, because there were no photocopies or printing presses for many centuries. So it had to be copied by hand, usually by monks in monasteries, from one generation to the next. And so because of this reason, and because many people for many centuries in Europe were illiterate for the most part, the source for getting the Word of God was through the church. You would go to the church, and that's where you would get the Word of God. But the Word of God was not really available for the common man. However, with the invention of the Gutenberg printing press around the time of the Reformation, and by the efforts of many people who were persecuted for doing this, but by the efforts of many people to translate the Bible into common languages for the different nations, the Bible was, around this time of the Reformation, was able to begin to be distributed widely throughout the world. And so for the last 500 years or so, we've had this period where people are able to get the Bible very easily in their own language. And this was a result of both the Protestant Reformation and also the invention of the Gutenberg printing press. And so that brings us up basically to this day and age, where we have the Protestant religions. We have the Catholic Church, which was primarily Western Europe. And then in the East, you had the Eastern Orthodox Church, which was the church of primarily the Byzantine area and so forth. And then those two churches had a great schism where they divided at one point in time. And so you had a separation between the Eastern Orthodox and the Catholic Church in the West, but that's another story. And so that brings us about to the modern day state of Christianity that we have now. In addition to that, let's talk a little bit about what happened with Israel when it was, for those who were not Christians, who were of the Jewish faith, what happened to them after the Bar Kokhba revolt in 135 AD, where basically the nation of Israel was destroyed, and all those that were left were sold into slavery and bondage throughout the Roman Empire. They would continue for many, many generations. They also were persecuted, just as many Christians were persecuted under the Romans. But they were persecuted for many, many centuries beyond that. And eventually, they were cast out of places like Spain and England and so forth. Many of them would settle in the land of Germany and Poland and that area, and then you had others that were from the Spanish area. But for many centuries, this would continue on, that Jews were persecuted in Europe, all the way up until, particularly under the Inquisition and so forth, but all the way up until the time of Adolf Hitler, which was a tremendous persecution, of course, with the Holocaust. And a couple of interesting events happened during that time that set forth the chain of events that would allow the Jews to return to the nation of Israel to create their own state for the first time since before the temple was destroyed in 70 AD. As I mentioned earlier, the Byzantines had pretty much controlled the Eastern Roman Empire for many centuries. However, the Ottoman Turks ended up conquering them, and the Islamic world ended up conquering them as well. And that includes the former land of Israel, which later, under the Romans, was under the capital of Aelia Capitolina and so forth. But then eventually the Muslim world would take over the nation of Israel. But then there was a period of crusades where the land was fought over between the Western Christian world and the Islamic world for many centuries. Eventually the Islamic world would continue to conquer that land, and that would become Palestine. However, after World War I, the British, being a member of the Allies, was at war with the Ottoman Turks, and they ended up reconquering the nation of Israel. And so Britain controlled it for several decades until shortly after World War II, when they decided that they were going to no longer control or have a colony over that particular area. And so after World War II, when the British mandate ended and they basically relinquished control of the area, the United Nations declared that the two people groups that were there that were vying for control of the land, which is the Palestinians and many of the Jews that were returning home, particularly after the Holocaust that happened in World War II, the United Nations determined that they would have the Jews would have their own state again for the first time since pretty much since the destruction of the temple in 70 AD. And so finally in 1948, you have the restoration of the nation of Israel. And then there was a major war that broke out at that time between the Arab nations, and that kind of really set the process of the Arab-Israeli conflict that's been going on for many decades up to the present day. But from about 1948 on, you have the restoration of the nation of Israel. And so there were several wars that occurred during that time. One particular war that's of note is the Six-Day War of 1967. And it was during that war that the Jews were able to recapture the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, which is the first time they've controlled that area since its destruction in 70 AD, because they did not control that prior to that point, even though they had land on the nation of Israel. Because of what happened in 1948, they did not control the Temple Mount until the Six-Day War in 1967. And so that brings us up basically to the present day, and there's still conflict and war and turmoil going on over there. But that's where we are in history. We're basically at the end of 6,000 years, and the Jews have returned back to their homeland. So a lot of the events that are foretold and talked about in the Bible are very pertinent to things that are going on in our generation, in our day and age. And many of these things are prophetic about the very soon return of Jesus Christ. So that is the overview, the historical account of what is discussed in the Bible, but also an overview of the contents of the Bible itself. So having said that, that's kind of the basis of the show. I just wanted to do a brief overview of that. In the next show, I am going to get into the actual Bible study portion. I've been kind of talking about that for a couple episodes now, but for sure we'll get into that next episode. We'll be starting with Genesis chapter 1. We'll do about 4 chapters at a time, so we'll do Genesis chapter 1, 2, 3, and 4. But please tune in to the next episode, and I appreciate you listening to the Wheat Barn Bible Talk Broadcast, and I hope that you have a blessed day, and we'll see you again in the future. Thanks.
You know Jesus is in the fire in your heart. Have you died to self and you're giving him the right to finish what he starts? Will you go to church every Sunday?
You've been listening to the wheatbarn.com Bible Talk Broadcast. All of our episodes are located at wheatbarn.com. That's WHEATBARN.com. All music for wheatbarn.com is provided free from godlychristianmusic.com, and the intro and exit music is Do You Know Jesus by Jeff Rice from godlychristianmusic.com. If you'd like to listen to more episodes in the future or check out our live shows, please go to wheatbarn.com for more information on the show, and we thank you very much for listening. Have a good day.
The passion in your eyes, all your righteous works and the sermons you heard could still end in your demise. Do you know Jesus? And is it consuming you like a fire? The new has come and the old is gone, and he's all that you desire. Do you know him? Yeah. I said, do you know him? Now they call you the man.